Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Covering Your Assets, the critical need for cybersecurity and data governance. I'm Sandy Jackalow, Chief Information Officer at Meridian Capital. I am also the chairperson of the REBNY Real Estate Board of New York's Cyber Technology Committee. We have a fabulous panel today, and I'm going to let them do some quick introductions before we move forward with our panel. Let's start off with Min.
Hi, everybody. My name is Min Kiryanis. I am the Managing Director of EMD JMK, as well as CEO of Amina Systems. I am also the co-founder of Global Cyber Consortium that I believe Sandy is also part of. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Kahim.
Hello, my name is Kahim Murphy. I am a Senior Cybersecurity Solutions Architect for Converge One. I have over 19 years experience designing, configuring, supporting, and troubleshooting complex enterprise and service provider security infrastructures. I was a former network and security practice lead, which pretty much gave me an incredible understanding around the dynamic security industry. I also hold CEH as well as a few other hacking certifications. And as a former red teamer, I performed multiple internal, external, as well as physical penetration tests and social engineering engagements.
Fabulous. Thank you. Srini.
Hi, good morning. My name is Srini Kandavli. I'm the Director of Smart Building Solution Architecture at Microsoft. As part of my role, I look at data integration architecture strategies for our southbound devices for our smart building implementations. And a core part of my job is to look at making sure our infrastructure is safe and secure as the devices are getting onboarded and then eventually managed and finally retired.
Great, thank you. And this is a fabulous panel. And just to frame our discussion today, one of the risks of smart connected buildings is exposure to cyber breaches. We have hundreds and possibly thousands of IoT devices creating terabytes of critical data that's being exchanged constantly. The risk of hacking and malicious activity in a building is very real. We see it every day in the news. The nice part, this panel with their great expertise and experience is going to share a lot of their real world experiences about how to protect your assets, how to protect your building data, and really, talk about the development of a robust cybersecurity plan, which includes a strategic design, data management, governance, system protection, along with training and education, which is, truly one of the most important parts of it. So with that, I'm going to start off, Min, with you. Protecting your assets starts with a plan. And let's talk about, where and how to position a security design. And, usually a lot of people, it's an afterthought, it's at the end, and, turning this into an effective project. So you want to start off?
Sure. And thank you again. So let's speak conventionally. Typically in the past, we always see security at the very end of any project design, which is unfortunate because now everybody and all the project teams are literally scrambling to make sure all the bits and pieces fit. The proper way really is, if you look at this from a very high level ecosystem, is really to start planning with the security team in place, whether it's physical security, cybersecurity, IT team. All of them should be sitting together at the table from the very beginning of the project to start establishing requirements and understanding what the requirements are. By putting it in, it becomes a retrofit. And that's the mistake I think many, I would say, project owners, owners, developers make the mistake of, is really seeing security at the very end of the project. And I'm sure the others here can probably chime in on that, but it's something to really reconsider as you're starting to plan a project out from beginning to end. And that's got to change, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Srini. It looks like you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, no, it's thanks for picking up on that, Sandy. That's absolutely right. A lot of times, I think what Min alluded to in terms of having an audit, it happens at the end, and it always baffles me in terms of why is that, right? Why can we not start a design as opposed to finishing the build, having an external entity? Typically, what happens, come in and say, well, you have a bunch of problems. Right? It seems somewhat inefficient to do it that way. And based on my experience of doing this both at Intel and now Microsoft, I'm taking a very conscious decision to make sure that the design is solid so that we don't have to do it as an afterthought. So completely agree, man. You're spot on.
Kaheen, any thoughts you want to add to this?
Yeah, for sure. And again, just adding to what and kind of shadowing what everyone else has been saying around that, it definitely needs to be a forethought, right? And you have to have or work with a company or have true integration with those projects between all aspects, right? Kind of to what you were saying, you have the physical aspect, you have, particular projects going to bring on new applications. So you need to work with someone who can integrate those things and establish that plan. And most importantly, I think, or one of the more important things is you need to be able to establish the requirements and establish a framework around those requirements, such as utilizing NIST things, some of the NIST frameworks around that. And that's kind of important, right? Because you're going to have to work with the security team in order to understand, what the privacy laws are and how they impact that project. And you're going to have to understand compliances as well and how they impact the project.
One of the things when I've thought about security designs that I'm amazed that people don't think about is the implications of a potential attack. For example, if somebody goes after your chillers in a smart building, it's not just the chillers. What other systems do those connect to? That could take out your HVAC, which means you can have a tenant that takes down their network because all of a sudden there's no building cooling to protect their network. So there can be this cascading event. And I think when people do designs and plans, one of the key things is understanding, what's the impact if they attack one system, what else gets impacted by it, because nothing is in isolation anymore.
And Sandy, you actually brought that up very, very, perfectly, because the reality is not everyone is sitting there. And I always say there's a day two team that has to be part of these conversations as well, right? Because initially you have a project team in the beginning who's doing all the beginning phases, but then there's the facilities team and the team that actually operates and maintains these systems that should be part of it, because they're the ones that are going to be maintaining the systems later on. So they really need to be part of these conversations initially, so that way they can properly plan, these type of engagements as, systems failures, or, there's a compromise, what needs to be done and who they need to reach out to. So in the past, it's always been very, very siloed. I think if there can be a change or an evolution where people start kind of talking more collaboratively from very beginning to end, you're going to find like these transitions from development to ownership is going to be a lot smoother than doing a OS moment. I can't curse, right? Oh my God, this doesn't work. What do we do now? And then you have to get these emergency teams to come in and start fixing these problems, which could be really, deferred if it was done properly from the very beginning.
Yeah, excellent point. So as we talk about all of these connected systems, everything is an IoT device, and each device is a potential doorway or gateway to an attack, to a breach. When I think about it, Srini, why don't you talk to us from some of the security measures that you've seen and that you think firms should implement to protect their assets with the plethora of IoT devices?
Sure. And, before I jump into that, I want to come back to a statement you made around, why are we doing this, right? And you talked about the fact that systems are not isolated. I think it's a spot on point. What I find in the industry today is people don't understand the impact of not doing security right. So there is a problem with that. And I'm going to answer your question, but I want to kind of delve a little bit deeper into the why, because ultimately we all know the why is what gets the funding, right? The how does not get the funding, right? So the why, right? I mean, it can impact your building infrastructure, right? So that's one aspect of it. It can also result in crossover attacks, right? Your IT infrastructure. And the worst is when it becomes a launch pad for external attacks, right? I mean, there's a very well publicized hack of secure surveillance cameras, which became a standing point for actually doing a bunch of DDoS attacks on external networks. So from a pure corporation liability perspective, it's not just about your building infrastructure, it's also about your IT infrastructure. And even the worst part is if it becomes a launch pad for external attacks. So all kinds of liability. So there is good reason to do this right. So now I'll get to your question.
Hold on. I want to just, and that's why I love this. This is a great conversation. When we think about IT and OT, and there's a convergence that's coming. At the end of the day, whether it's a computer on the desktop or or an IoT device, to your point, it's all one system. And once you breach one, and once somebody's in the system, they can pretty much go wherever they want. And it really isn't, isolated. And the IT is not siloed anymore. And I think at some point, it's not going to be IT and OT. I think it's really going to become converged. So I completely agree with you. Great point.
So now coming to your question.
Wait, hold on, Srini.
Go ahead.
This is fun.
Great conversation again. But I think that kind of goes back to the initial point, right, of the planning. Right, you have to have that initial stage of planning and make sure that your environments are secured the best way possible. So again, great conversation. I just want to add, like, the planning piece is probably one of the utmost important pieces in any project or moving forward with any type of security measures, right? To get the right controls in place. So again, to Srini's point, that lateral movement doesn't happen through your network if you have proper controls in place. And that all comes down to planning and understanding your environment and what needs to be and what's on your environment at that point. I'm done. Sorry.
No, that's great. No, listen, I love it. There's 4 people hanging out at a bar without drinks right now talking about cybersecurity.
Imagine what would happen with drinks.
Yeah. So now coming to your question, and I think this is a fabulous question, right? Because ultimately, a lot of times people get lost in the details, but they're not able to abstract, right? And I know it's a gross generalization, but my point is in terms of really being able to understand what to do, right? There are 1,000 things to do, but ultimately they fall into categories, right? And if you think of it in terms of categories, you can come up with a plan, right? It's as simple as that. We think in terms of categories, right? So my categories, and it's not a exhaustive list, but this is how I think, right? There are 3 or 4 things you need to do in order to do this right. And I'd love to hear Kaheen's response once I do this, because this is a guy that here's an expert here. So I'm worried he might critique me now. But anyway, I'm going to go out on a limb here.
No, absolutely not.
So there are a couple of things you need to do. First, make sure that you secure your payload, because ultimately we know that there's so many updates coming to your infrastructure, right? That you want to make sure that somehow someone is not slipping in some malware. That's the first point. The second point is secure your channel, right? What do I mean by this? We all know of things like man-in-the-middle attacks, right? Is your channel secure, by which those updates are actually happening to your infrastructure, right? And finally, secure your devices, right? Are your devices secure in terms of being locked down so that only the right updates are happening to your infrastructure, right? Through making sure that ports are not opened, or now you get into those mitigation strategies like, hey, who has these passwords, right? Who, is the USB port disabled or not, right? I mean, at the end of the day, if you take a look at how attacks happen, there are finite ways that it happens. There's not infinite ways, right? And again, that's what is very interesting about this space, that if you think in terms of categories, it helps you come up with a plan, and then your risk mitigation strategies come in, which can directly tie to those finite number of things that you need to protect against, right? So, it's that combination of how do I secure my device? How do I secure my channel? How do I secure my payload, right? And what do I need to do that in those categories to make sure that, my infrastructure end to end is secure? Because the challenge today is most of these vendors are going to the cloud, right? So now you have more surface points for an attack, right? It's not your old BMS where some guy is coming, or a gal is coming into your building. I wanted acknowledgement here.
That's all right. I'll shake my head. Just saying.
So, a lot of these things are initiated from the cloud. So I'll stop on my, 30,000 foot level summary here, but would love to hear from Kaheen and everyone else.
Sure. So thanks, Srini. And you're right. I really like the categories, right, and breaking the categories down and understanding how to secure those different things. But I think we have to take a step back and look at it in the terms of, if I have a moment, if I could pick on IoT devices themselves, right? IoT devices were designed to work and just to work. There was no forethought in putting security in any of the code, right? So they are actually, again, one of the most potential doorways into a cyber attack. That being said, if we can kind of go through the planning stage, right? We have to first understand that. We have to accept the fact that IoT devices are very acceptable, right? Now, the one thing that we have to have, or that you actually need in your environment, is you have to understand, have that data visibility. And what I mean by that is, if I have a camera, what should this camera be talking to, and how should it be talking to that device, right? So you have to have that data visibility and that data telemetry. So you have to have a tool there in order to understand that. And that will start building anomalies, right? And we can understand those anomalies, or if we see an anomaly. So it goes back to first understanding that IoT devices are very susceptible. The next thing it goes to is understanding the data visibility and data telemetry. I'm a big fan of MDRs, managed detection and response and managing services, because they can do that, right? They can provide some of those things. To your point, let's first if we understand that this device is not secure, then how do we secure that device? Then we have to understand, what is this device talking to? So that is that channel you're speaking of, right? So how do we secure that channel? And how does that affect our critical infrastructure? For example, there should be no reason why, again, my camera is talking to my accounting server. Like what happens there? And then be able to detect those anomalies, right? So I think those are big things. And we have to understand that with IoT devices, they weren't built with that computational power to do encryption and things like that. So it's up to something else to encrypt those channels, or something else to secure those channels, or have a secured visibility, or let's not even say secure visibility, I'll just say have visibility of what is communicating to what and how that communication is had. Because at any point, if I can intercept that communication, and this is where the secure communication comes in, stopping that interception, right, then I can exfiltrate data that way, right, all day long, or even start doing lateral movement. Another thing you brought up was about access, right? Who has access, and how does this access work? And now we start getting into privileged access management type of solutions as well. If the system user on a particular Windows box is, and again, system is kind of God on a Windows box, if I kind of digress a little bit here, but how are we monitoring that particular aspect? And how do we do that around an IoT device? Because again, it does not have that computational power in order to provide us with that information. So you have to have something in place in order to do that. Another thing that you have to think about when you start talking about IoT devices and how they be in that doorway, that access, is there are NAC solutions, right? Network access controls, things that are out there that can profile the devices and understand and gain that visibility on what's on your network. And again, securing those channels, securing devices, and securing who has access to those devices. I think you hit the nail on the head on those. I like that. Hopefully I didn't confuse. Hopefully I answered.
Oh yeah, this is great. You've the first thing is you really hit the spot with regards to the signature of the devices. And this is one area that vendors are doing an amazing job of creating a signature database so that they know exactly how these devices should work. And the minute that there's an anomaly, there's actually a couple of vendors who are doing this AI type analysis in the cloud of, hey, wait a minute, why is our camera spitting out so much network traffic when it's not really supposed to do that, right? So, but Min, would you agree with the framework, or am I missing something with the framework?
So I do agree with the framework, but I also want to take a further step back. I think at the very end of the day, a strategy has to be implemented by the owners on that end, right? And I think the challenge is people worry about the device a lot, which is great. It is a big thing, but I think there has to be a strategic plan in place, a cyber strategic plan in place in terms of how they deal with foreign IoT devices. Because I pretty much take a look at IoT devices and I look at these devices as, all right, these are foreign devices that are going on my network. In an IT mindset, you have a beta test or a site that's emulating a live production set to test these devices on before it goes live in production. A lot of times with the IoT devices, people don't think like that. They just take the device and plug it onto the network and say, oh, great, it works. And to Kaheen's point, security was not developed or written into the code of these devices. He's 100% right. And if we take another step back, the legacy devices that people are retrofitting to put on the network is even more unsecure if you think about it, because no one thought about security, with systems that are 20, 30 years ago, and now you're retrofitting it to become smart. So that being said, I think a strategic plan, especially at the levels of the C levels, they need to really start taking a look, not just at categories, but also how to, I would say, take a look at these devices that are foreign coming in that they're going to be putting on the network and saying, all right, if this is a X device that we're going to put, we need to do these kind of tests to ensure that there's some sort of protection that we can put around this device if it's really needed by the teams that's maintaining these systems. So I think a strategic plan at the very highest level need to be established, the higher ups. For me, without that plan, I think there's no consistency, and I think there has to be some sort of consistency in place to establish all these roles of these pieces of equipment. Before I start going in a different language, the roles of all these various pieces of equipment, and also the roles of people, like who's maintaining these devices, is going to be key and critical here. And establishing those requirements are going to be so important at the very highest level.
And one of the things that I'll add, and you've all kind of touched on it, and I'm just going to phrase it a different way, is once these systems are in production, monitoring is critical. And I've seen too many companies that have monitoring set up. They're getting alerts because they get too many alerts because they're, it's too noisy, and people are missing key pieces of information that say, hey, you've got a problem over here. And they don't either know how to troubleshoot it, diagnose it, or understand, sometimes you're going to get false positives and false negatives. And I think that is one thing that IT shops in general have done a poor job on, is really understanding and keeping an eye on the monitoring and alerting.
Sure. And I would like to touch on that as well, Sandy. We see it 100 times over and over with multiple customers. And just as an example, hey, I want to get this really wonderful NGFW, next generation firewall in place, and I want you to turn on everything, right? I want to see it all. I want to gain this visibility. And so day one, what happens is this thing is not tuned. So the inbox is flooded, and the security guys sitting there going, oh, this is wonderful. I'm getting all these alerts. Day three, they're going, whoa, wait a minute, hold on. What do I do? So what do? They end up creating a rule within Outlook, right, to pipe these things off to a folder. Day four, what happens with that? They come back and say, you know what, I really don't have time to go through all these. So they Control-A, delete all of the alerts, and we get back to it. So absolutely proper systems, and that's why I'm a big fan of managed detection and response, right? Because it kind of lifts that from the security, it takes it away from that one guy trying to do everything. In a lot of shops now, a lot of companies today, they are running lean, a little bit leaner, right? They're running lean IT, and the security guy is wearing multiple hats at this point. He's doing networking, or it's the network guy who's wearing the security hat at that point. And there's other fires that need to be addressed. And but to your point, so I just want to reiterate that I see this day in, day out, right? Like, and again, they could be missing some valuable alerts. So it is important to have, someone come in and assist, or someone that's skilled enough to help you with some type of maybe a SIM. And again, I'm a big fan of MDR, or even just tuning those systems so you don't overlook those, so you don't miss those positives versus, the multitude of false positives. But that is definitely the cycle. It happens over and over again. I see it all the time.
I got to tell you, I'm sitting here, as you can see, I'm smiling because I feel like you've been standing by my shoulder watching some of the things. And like, oh my God, he was there. I'm not crazy. I'm not the open seat and stuff. And
you're not.
It's so important. So while we're on the topic of monitoring and all these IoT devices, they're all sitting there producing all of this data. And quite often, if it's a security system, you've got people's identification information, depending on what other kinds of system. There's a lot of PII, personally identifiable information, which can create a problem. Kaheen, I'm going to turn this one to start with you. How do you best secure some of the data, that particularly ones with PII, and think about data governance, and what do you consider in this overwhelming data set that we have?
Well, I think the first thing you have to look at is what data is there, right? What type of data is there? Because you're going to have data in a couple of different places. You have to look at privacy, especially, right? Look at the privacy laws that are there and how to build your governance around your policies. We can say governance. I don't really like, because it really comes down to policies, right? at the end of the day, a policy.
It was in the title of this session, so I had to use the word.
Right. So you have to so first you have to, and again, we have to keep going back to the initial question, is the planning. So in that planning phase, this is where you have to start identifying. So that's the key thing. So, let's take the cybersecurity framework, right? You have to, what's the first thing? Yeah, identify, right? You have to understand what's there. And so once you start in that planning phase, understanding what's there and looking at that data, right? Understanding if there are any privacy or compliance requirements around that data. Now we have to start looking at what's being collected, where that data is being housed, because you're going to have data in transit and you're going to have data at rest. And how do you secure the data in transit as well as the data in rest? Also, here's a good way of looking. Please keep in mind, security doesn't equal privacy, and privacy does not equal security. So we have to also understand that there are two separate different buckets, right? Like, now, your privacy will dictate what security you have to put in place and within your particular environment, but they are not the same. Where that data is, what that data is, and who needs access to that data. So this is a very important thing to me. I've been in environments or seen environments where, say, you would have not your typical user on the network, and they would have access, say, to data that really had nothing to do with their job functionality, right, at all. And that, to me, is definitely an attack vector, right? If I know, like, this guy is an accountant, if I can ascertain that this, as the accountant, he's able to, say, get to HR records or vice versa, then I can start attacking that person, right, from a social standpoint or whatever. But it allows me a vector. Aside from that, this is where I think a zero trust strategy will come into place, right? We trust nothing, right? And that will absolutely ascertain who gets access to what data. And this is just, again, in general, talking whether it's data at rest or data in motion at that point. DLP, let's start thinking about DLP. So once we have these controls established around the data, once we have, say, a zero trust plan, once we're only allowing the proper access to proper users to that particular data, then how do we understand where that data is going? Who's to say that disgruntled coworker, or let's even back up, he's not disgruntled. That person is about to leave the company. Let's just take sales. They're going to leave the company. They've been working with multiple customers. How do we know, as purveyors of the network, or purveyors of security of that network, how do we know that right before this person is leaving, they're not dumping gigs to their iCloud, right, of customer information? So there has to be a good DLP solution in place around that data, or helping us have visibility of that data. I always go back to visibility because that is kind of key. Again, privileged access management. Who has access and should they have access? Visibility. And then once you understand those things, now you can set up your governance, you can set up your policy, but it all has to go back to an understanding of what's there, what the data is, and where that data needs to go.
Yeah. And one thing, for those in the audience who may not know what DLP is, data loss prevention. So just to clarify that acronym. Srini, Min, do you want to add anything to the data side of this?
To me, it's, and so I'll chime in here. So data is an interesting beast, and I think he nailed it. People seem to think data privacy is the same as cybersecurity. It is not. It's two separate elements governed by two different groups of people. Data privacy typically goes into the compliance side, and then you have the security side, which is then the CISO side. So that being said, I think there has been establishment of what's deemed a PII, what has to be secured, what has to be encrypted. And I think that's where the chief compliance officer and the CISO needs to sit together, start establishing these requirements and saying, all right, if we have a data warehouse that's filled with some of these, I would say, PII information, personally identifiable information that can go back to an individual, how do we secure that? And how do we protect that data? And I think they have to work together to start establishing these processes in place and ensure, then go back to the logistics team, the IT team or the security team, say, all right, guys, here's what we need to do. How do we protect this? How do we get it? And how do we put it together later on? And that is a very, very key thing that has to happen from the very beginning. What I find a lot of the times is people come in and says, oh, we got to protect PII now. And I think this happened with the GDPR last year. There was a lot of folks in many companies that just went towards waited till the last minute to say, oh my God, we have to start being worried about PII because GDPR is coming and we don't want to get fined. So now everyone is scrambling to actually start establishing these requirements, and that's a mistake. So if you start having these folks in the very beginning and start establishing these rules and requirements, it's a little easier to transition over later on to actually start protecting the data properly. So that way you can put it together later on again. But I think right now there's an education that has to be had in many corporations. The more sophisticated ones typically have teams that are, I would say, well versed in this area, and then you have ones that are still trying to feel it out and work it out.
Right.
Going back to some of what Kahim said in terms of data at rest and data in motion, you can tell he's a practitioner, so great to hear his insights. Earlier on, I was talking about abstractions, and now I'll say, when it comes to PII, you want to probably focus on details, right? Because one of the things that gets lost is where is the compute happening, right? I'll just take an example of comparing and contrasting approaches with regards to what is your risk, right? Because you also have to think in terms of risk. So let's just take a people occupancy sensor, right? And if it's capturing images, that's PII data. Now, is that image, what is the quality of that image, right? Again, details matter, right? If it's high res, absolutely PII. If it's low res, you can't make out anything. So your risk is lower, right? Also, where is the compute happening? Is it happening at the camera? Or are you transmitting that image over the wire to the cloud, right? So your attack vectors and what you need to do in order to secure PII becomes a great function of where the compute is happening and what is that data, right? Because that will result in a risk, whether you have risk or not, right? So I think it's a complex topic, but it is one where you really need to jump in with a good understanding of how vendors, typically vendors, are processing that data.
And I will say that PII, the biggest challenge with that, if you have a data breach, and we've seen a lot of them, we saw a couple just in the last week or so in real estate, depending on who your clients are, celebrities, high net worth individuals, the risks get greater, and it really goes to brand and reputation, and it really can hurt a firm. And one of the things that I want to touch on that you've all kind of touched on, and I'm going to go back to you. It's often said that people are the greatest cyber risk we have. What training, education strategies have you seen been successful to date to address the human element of cybersecurity? Which also not only protecting it from a networking side, but there's also the physical access side of it as well.
Sure. Yeah, that's a really good question. That's a really good point there. So the effective training needs to happen initially. So let's take a new employee, right? There has to be some type of training around social or being social engineered, right? Or that physical aspect, or excuse me, that social aspect during that onboarding process. For example, let's just kind of digress a second. Let's talk about malware, right? And everyone knows malware. Everybody knows about ransomware now. I don't have to go into detail around that, but one of the biggest vectors of that is email. So there has to be training around people or your employees or your staff to say, hey, this email looks bad, is it bad? And understand what is bad and what is not bad. So the initial training, as far as the onboarding process, there also has to be some sign off to that training. So you can say if someone accidentally clicks on that, I have a sticker that I have on my laptop, and it says don't click explicative, right? And so that's part of that training methodology, right? You don't click on anything, always have that human on, because the human, to me, is in fact a person can be, in regard IoT, right? An IoT device. We are hackable. We are not built with security in mind. We don't think normally that way. So they are one of the most exploitable portions of the network is the person. I think we can go back to some old movies. Everyone's exploitable, right? As a person, because when you start looking at social engineering, things like that, one of the initial things you have to do within social engineering is establish an emotional bond, right? And that can be done via email, things like that. The other training that has to happen there, and we can just talk about email, we can't just talk about email, but the other training that has to happen there is there has to be some training around how employees are able, or there has to be some policy built around this as well, around social networking. So people don't understand social networking, or finding you out on social networking can be my gateway to crafting a particular email to get you to click on something, or to get you to divulge some of your PII, so I can infiltrate your company at that point. So that training has to be established initially from that onboarding process. But then there has to, just like penetration testing, there has to be regular testing around these social engineering aspects. So that covers, say, the digital front. But let's talk about physical access and things like that, right? As far as a person walking through the door. This also is part of that training process. Employees have to be trained in order to look for certain things. There has to be a policy built around it. In other words, no one is allowed in the building without a badge, right? Make sure you're looking at badges. Make sure you ask questions. Have a person at that front desk that can have some type of visitor access software, right? As I like to call it. There has to be something there to be able to really identify that person. Require some other form of ID other than a badge. And just be aware, right? Just be aware. If you every day go out and eat lunch in front of the building, or if a person every day goes out and eat lunch in front of the building, and, say they do this for a month, and there's a new person, they see someone out there that kind of doesn't look like they belong or haven't seen them before, ask the question, like, who are you? And don't be scared to ask the question, right? So I think that's one of the biggest things, but you have to have training initially. There has to be training throughout, and there has to be some type of, accountability that training has been taken and accepted, and you understand, and the employees understand it. So it goes from the beginning all the way through to continuous testing, just like pen testing. So,
Srini, anything that you'd like to add to the human element part?
I think very comprehensive. So good.
Min, anything that you'd like to add as well?
Oh my God, complacency is always fun. I don't know how many people we see walking around with their heads on their phones and just walking through traffic without even realizing they're crossing a red light.
Well, it's kind of really, for me, what blows me away is how many times on social media you see people posting their COVID vaccination cards with their date of birth, all this
everything.
private, all this PII information that literally sets themselves up for all these other challenges and issues. And it's just, so when you think about education, it is the simplicity of just, no, don't do that.
Don't do it. It's a mindset change. I think it has to happen. I think we've become so complacent with technology and with having the convenience of everything automated for us. I mean, we look at our phones, turn a thermostat on for crying out loud. So that way we go home, it's comfortable. So I think really to Kaheen's point, there's got to be a mindset change also from beginning to end. And it's not just, the social engineering aspect of it. It's really pulling yourself out and becoming more aware of technology around you. I mean, I think we become so reliant as human beings to technology. It's a little scary. I mean, even my kids at 2 years old, before she couldn't even talk, was swiping the TV screen, trying to, get it to change. I mean, if you think about it. So that being said, I think there's got to be an element where we have to train, I would say, personnel, people, just get their heads out of their phones with technology that's out there. And I hate to say stop and smell the roses, but the reality is we're so sucked into technology. We're so wired that we have to know every single thing at this second when someone dies. I mean, look at it. When someone dies, they post it right away. So I think there's got to be a reality check here as well, that I think even whether it's part of an employee onboarding session that says, hey guys, we understand you're connected to technology, but here's some reality checks for you. It's great, but please step back and take a look at technology and how you can be sucked in and become a target later on. The social engineering aspect. How quickly it is for me to track someone down. It takes me less than 5 minutes to track an individual down. All I need is their name, place of location, give me an idea, even on their LinkedIn, and I can pretty much find out what their birth date is, where to live, and pretty much track all this down in less than 5 minutes. And it's a very scary thing that all the information is out there. So Kaheen, you know this very well. But I think it's not just this training of social engineering. It's really training to get yourself out of being sucked into technology and how connected we are to technology.
Well, and what's interesting, Kaheen, go ahead. It looks like you want to say
Yeah,
something.
no, I just was like, man, was like so spot on with that. I was trying to stay away from scaring everyone to death, but
I'm sorry.
It kind of jumped out there. But no, it's quite all right. But and I want to add to that. Don't think of it from an employee-employer standpoint, right? To Min's point, we have to train ourselves as individuals. One of the things that I saw, and I'm going to give this quick example, but I'm going to be quiet. Here recently, and I have pictures of this, and I would be happy. It's all blurred out, but this is pre-COVID. I was on an airplane, and on that airplane, I was sitting in the aisle seat, and I just happened to glance over, and there was a gentleman next to me. Now, this is the mindset of a hacker sometimes, right? We always kind of look at things differently. As I'm looking over, this gentleman pulls his duffel bag up, and on the edge of his duffel bag, it was a little mesh pocket. And in that mesh pocket, he not only had his ID in there. He didn't have a passport. He just had a driver's license. But it also had his credit card right next to it. And both numbers were facing myself. So, of course, being the person I am, I take out my phone and I act like I'm sending a text, and I actually just snap a couple pictures of it zoomed in. So I had this person's ID. But we as individuals, and I use that as an example in a prior talk that I had of how we have to change as people, right, as individuals, because generally speaking, we are very trusting, and that's okay to be very trusting, but the time and day has changed, right? Technology is everywhere. There's always a camera. There's always information. We are always exposing our own PII, right? So don't think of it from a company standpoint. Think of it from a human being standpoint. But anyway, I digress.
Well, no, it's perfect.
I don't want to scare people no more.
No, but we have to. People have to wake up a little bit, and COVID has changed everything forever, because first of all, we have employees at home sharing their network with their kids, with their schools, I have somebody in my office who was complaining about performance. And I said, okay, well, let's talk about your network. They were jumping on their neighbor's network because it wasn't password protected. So not only were they a threat, but they were tied to their neighbor's network, and who knows what's on it. So with that, the way our vendors access our buildings, the way our employees access our networks, have completely, been spun on a brand new paradigm with COVID. Srini, what advice would you give to owners, managers, and given this past conversation, even just the everyday employee who's connecting or, dealing with these little nuances to better secure remote access and things that they need to think about?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very wide question, but going back to what Kaheen said, right? Creating a zero trust environment. I mean, it's one thing. It's being able to not allow that attack to happen, right? So, policies, right? When vendors are logging in, especially with devices, I keep on coming back to devices. That's my area of expertise. We need to make sure that enterprise policies are also being able to be proliferated to those devices, right? Ultimately, I mean, I just think in terms of probability. I mean, for me, I can't solve everything, but if I had to solve one thing, it would be passwords, right? And ensuring that we lock it down and we create that audit trail, right? And again, going back to another thing that was mentioned earlier on, with regards to allowing people access only to those assets that they need to have access to from a business perspective, right? So these are just a couple of ideas. I mean, locking down your infrastructure and then also making sure that access is governed based on business need would be my answer.
Min, what would you like to add to this? Because I know you have some opinions on it.
Oh God, I have lots of opinions, but then it's not legal. So let's just put it that way. That being said, honestly, I think COVID is just such an interesting time. Everybody's trying to gain access. And again, I think passwords is a key thing that Srini talked about, but policies. I mean, one of the key things with remote access is a huge liability now because you don't control the network. It is the individual's home network, which is a little different and managed a lot differently. So there's some liability at risk in terms of intellectual property that's on this individual's computer that they're working on. So if they're compromised, God knows what else is going to be compromised. So that being said, I think it's going to be a very interesting conversation with having a hybrid workforce now with COVID. And I think policies will need to be strengthened in terms of responsibilities and accountability. I think that's a key word is accountability. If an employee is going to be remoting, working from home and accessing the work network, what kind of accountability is in place if the employee at home is not as secure, I'm going to say, as their work environment? I mean, that's a big question, especially now with 75% of the workforce being at home, maybe more. And it's putting lots of corporations at risk, in my opinion. So, I think policies has to be reviewed and addressed as to how employees are securing their devices at home. That's first and foremost. And two, third-party vendors, if they're going to remotely access these systems, that has to be in place as well and establish some criteria. That way you don't have issues like the Target breach. I think that was, if I remember correctly, that was a remote access from a VMS vendor.
A few things that we do, in these times is, particularly for key systems, we need your IP address. So we lock down firewall rules so that, each user from a very specific IP address. So if somebody else is trying to connect, they can't come in. There are a lot of things within our company that unless you're on a corporate device, you cannot access the system. You cannot download data because, to DLP before, we don't want all of a sudden, all the files from a system being downloaded to somebody's home computer. So there are a few simple things, relatively simple things that employers can do, like locking down by firewalls, kind of corporate devices only.
VPN access, yep.
MDM, making sure that you're monitoring and, even as travel is starting to, kind of pick up again, lock it down geographically so that you can only come in from certain countries. And if they do, it's, two-factor authentication. It's, we need to know that you're going away because you're not going to be able to access your email if you're over in the UK. So there are some things just to tighten up the network that I think can be done along with the education side.
I would like to add to that as well. In this era of COVID, right, there's been a larger push to the cloud as well. So I think one of the pieces of that and that has to be incorporated into that policy will be your data visibility into the cloud, right? Like a good, having a CASB there to broker, what information you can access. Because a lot of times at this day and time, users aren't coming to the corporate network and then going to the cloud or they're going directly from home to the cloud. So we can't forget about cloud when we start talking about, even under the guise of remote access, right? You can't forget about cloud access at that point. And then, a mechanism, something like, when we start talking zero trust, Trina hit on it, zero trust, right? Have to look at something like, MFA, something that provides a zero trust type of environment. That's my opinion around it.
Yeah, and
I think I said everything legal. I didn't say anything illegal, did I, mean?
Probably would say something not legal, so I'll leave it at that.
It's interesting. At the time that we're in, prop tech is such a big thing in real estate, and everything for the most part in prop tech is cloud-based. People are going out there making vendor selections, and one of the things that is really at the forefront is a cyber component. It's not just about what business challenges can a prop tech solution address, but there's got to be cyber and a whole range of things. I mean, it's from logins, it's securing the data. It's an amazing how many prop tech companies I talk to where they're really not prepared, for cyber. So with that, Min, with some of the less, mature prop tech companies that are delivering the functionality, what recommendations would you give not only the prop tech companies, but those real estate firms selecting prop tech solutions to help improve security? Because, to Kaheen's point, that is going to be the next wave of exposure points.
Agreed. And I like to call it the invisible threat or the invisible warfare that's going to be happening in the near future. That being said, ask questions, ask a lot of questions and get the right people, the proper people at the planning stages in the very beginning, because the minute you have the right people at the table, you become more flexible in terms of actually compromising on what the system needs to be versus, rushing to fix it, fixing it later on when you realize it doesn't work. And really that's the key critical point is proper planning in the very beginning. We talked about it in the very beginning when we first started the session. Planning, getting the right people at the table to talk about it. And it's not just the project side of it, it's also the day two side, which is the people who are managing these systems for you. So they need to be sitting at the table and really kind of going through what their experiences are so you understand the components and properly, plan what's needed to work these systems out or architect these systems properly.
Srini, thoughts on, and it's not, by the way, it's not only prop tech, it could be fintech, it's a lot, contech for construction. I mean, it really applies to all of these new solutions that are coming on board and, biometrics and everything else. So thoughts?
Yeah, I think we're slightly over time. So, but I think
I thought we were till 12:15.
Okay, so I'm sorry. So my bad. Yeah, I think she summarized it well. I mean, just having a strategic plan, looking at these different, assets that we have at our fingertips in order to, really create a secure environment. I think is looking at it holistically. At the end of the day, like you mentioned, there's so many different types of potential threats. There's devices, there are other systems, cloud-based vendors, et cetera, that you really need to think of a holistic approach of how you will secure your systems, right, against the various different type of threats that are going to be essentially being posed, right? So yeah, I think I would leave it with that. Just think holistically.
Kaheen?
Yeah, just repeat what everyone else said, right? Definitely think holistically. Proper planning, right? Using a framework, identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. If we can go back to the NIST framework, that applies in, let's just not talk about prop tech companies, but any organization. A couple other things when you start looking at, if we go back to IoT and looking at those, if there's assistance out there, there's things out there that help you. I think there's a NIST 800.213 as well, which is the IoT framework, right, for IoT devices. Good password hygiene, patch management, privilege management, everything that we kind of talked about earlier today, kind of, summed up here in how do we deliver these solutions and kind of how do you improve security. So I think everything that we've discussed previously, it definitely applies to just improve security overall, and not just for prop tech, but for any firm.
Hey, Kaheen, just really quick, you mentioned something interesting, so I want to kind of pick up on that. Is there a guideline? Did you talk about it? Is that an IEEE standard or for IoT devices? Is there some standards that people can refer to with regards to seeing basically that gives them a path to secure their infrastructure?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I'm sorry, but yeah, absolutely. That goes back to the NIST 800.213. That is the draft for government-specific IoT frameworks and how to introduce IoT devices into your environment.
Wow.
So I would absolutely rely on that. Yeah, not just that, but again, just the NIST cybersecurity framework as well. So those two together can help companies or help people along that path as well. Also working with a true integration company, right? A company that can come in and kind of pull these things together and help facilitate the discussion between what's needed, as far as requirements, and then bring it all into fruition. Somebody with like a proven methodology, and if I say so, right, there has to be, like, for example, let me give you an example on what we do. We have what we call a Waves workshop. And we'll come in and we'll do a workshop, and we'll do an assessment, which is, pretty much quantitative, and look at, discovery, look at real-time discovery, gaps, risk and analysis, misalignment. We validate, right? So we look at the validation piece. We look at your enterprise architecture. We look at, and then we provide you a solution, right? But the initial thing is you have to, be able to to bring those pieces together. Like everything we talked about can easily be put into a silo, right? And easily just stay in that one area and never have that overall umbrella of being brought together. In a lot of companies, I found out as well, they kind of work in silos, right? The networking team doesn't know what the security team needs, or the security team doesn't understand what the networking team needs. The server teams are just introducing these applications and nobody has any idea what these applications are doing, where they're going, and who they're talking to. And that also opens up vectors. Especially, if we kind of take, the post, the COVID era right now, there was a big push to facilitate access. So security and networking, they're kind of, they're two opposite ends of the spectrum. Security, we want to stop access. Networking guys just want to provide access, right? So there has to be somebody to facilitate those communications, right, to understand. But they're also, and again, this whole thing goes all the way back to our initial discussion, planning. Right, it all comes down to planning, bringing everybody to the table, everybody discussing, understanding those requirements, and then putting together and facilitating the plan to move forward.
And I just want to just pipe in there one thing you said, amplify that, right? And I've done this previously at another company where, having subject matter experts come in and do audits is really key, because that understanding of IT systems, OT systems, and understanding typical threat vectors, because it's almost like, some of this is tribal knowledge, right? These people have seen, they're like, walking around with this knowledge about typical threats and how to mitigate them. And when you take a look at this, I think it's very important to get that perspectives in, because they can help you create. And I'm not talking about a specific vendor, but more just as I would call a suggestion of saying, find people with the domain expertise because the signatures of attack will vary, right? Some of them are generic, but some of them would be very specific, right, to your given situation.
And I will say, I think it's important, there are a lot of great resources out there, from NITS to InfraGard to US CERT, that are constantly putting alerts out there of different threats, different exposures. There are some great industry organizations, there's Global Cyber Consortium.
They're tongue-tied now.
I know. The GCC, there's the REBNY Technology Committee. The folks at Connected are constantly doing, cyber webinars. There are a lot of resources out there, not only for the IT teams, but for employees and senior management to really understand the exposure and the threat that's going on. So I think, when we talk about education about people, it's also about getting the word out so that they can understand that this threat is real, and they've got to keep on top of it. We have about 2 minutes left, so I want to go around the room real quickly for any, like 30 seconds of any final thoughts. I'll start with you, Min.
Oh, gee, thanks a lot. Put me in a hot seat. But I think you kind of laid it out real well. If you don't know who the SMEs are, or if you're looking for one, do reach out to organizations that specialize in this. And this is a great one. It's a framework. You have, if you're in the government side, the CMMC, you also have on the ICS side, IEC 62443. So there's quite a bit of, frameworks and requirements that's out there. So definitely, if you don't know about one, reach out to like REBNY or even us to ask questions, or even anyone on this panel to ask questions about it, because I think we could probably gear you towards the right direction on what to look for, really.
Srini.
Yeah, just to reiterate what I said, think holistically, right? And bring in SMEs that will help you create a plan and then eventually deploy that, because just from the beginning to the end, this was talked about earlier with regards to, hey, having a situation where you're inundated with alerts, and everybody said, yeah, we all related to that. You don't want that. So start at the beginning with the end in mind. I want a comprehensive working cyber strategy, and what does that look like? So, yep.
Thank you. Kaheen.
Yeah, again, just to restate everything everyone else is saying. or has stated already, make sure you have that planning phase in there. If you don't work with a company that are true integrators, can bring those things together, facilitate those conversations across the board. Back to the social engineering piece, educate yourself. Try to adjust the mindset that you have about putting information out there to be gathered, right? To be not just used against you personally, but to be used against, say, your company. So just kind of a rethought. Before you post it, think, right? Don't just click the send button. Before you post it, think about what you're posting. And the other thing is, the last thing I wanted to leave off with, again, there are other things out there, we've discussed this, we've discussed NIST, we've discussed 2 frameworks there, but there's also the MITRE ATT&CK framework as well that can also, and many, many other resources that can let you know what is active out there today.
Okay. I want to thank the 3 of you. It's been a fabulous, fascinating panel. You've all been fabulous. So thank you for making my job so easy. I also want to thank the entire team at Connected for putting together this conference. There's still a lot of great sessions left for the rest of the day. So I kind of invite everybody who's watching this one to, stay tuned and follow some of the other panels. And again, I want to thank particularly, aside from the Connected team, I want to thank, Rich Berliner and Darlene Pope for putting together this great event. So thank you to everybody that joined us out in, Cyberland. And again, thank you to the fabulous panel. I really appreciate it.
Have a great day, guys.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care. Everyone have a good day.